Okay, so good morning or afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. As Trish said, I'm Helen St. Denis. I work for Stilo. So this is a bit about me. Most of it doesn't really matter. Stilo has been involved in semantic markup and in getting unstructured content into structure for now. It's very close to 40 years. So originally it was SGML, then XML, and now we're primarily focused on DITA, but we do have experience with other XML formats as well. So as we go through today, I will mostly be dealing with DITA markup, but we'll talk a little bit about things that are relevant to other types of markup as well. So in my role at Stilo, I have helped many people get their unstructured content, or sometimes structured in a different way, into DITA or other structured XML formats. And of course, they all have different requirements, different situations. So I've had many a customer be very concerned about getting as much of the semantic markup out of the original as they possibly can. So very detailed, accurate semantic markup. And then I've had other customers who have just said to me, look, I just want it to look the same when it's published from DITA as it does when I publish it from Word. And then, of course, there are also customers who want both because of the advantages of semantic markup, and yet they still want a consistent look and feel. They know that their audience expects certain things to look a certain way, so they'll understand it more quickly. So we can do both, in fact, if both are needed. We don't have to choose one or the other. So first off, what is semantic markup? Semantic markup is markup that essentially instructs the machine that's reading it as to the purpose of the content. So you can see here that on this slide, when I prepared this slide, I went to the PowerPoint designer bar and I chose this one, and I thought, let's see what this one does. So what this display does is it indicates quickly that there are 3 main points on this slide, and that's fine. So I was curious about the icons, though, how they were assigned, because they, in this case, don't seem to assign much value. I can tell by looking at the last point that probably they saw the word presentation and said, okay, this is a presentation. So they put the screen on there. The others aren't all that helpful. So going from the unstructured to something that helps us understand automatically isn't necessarily reliable. I thought that was an interesting sort of counterpoint to what we actually want. So we tell the machine what the purpose is, and from there, it can be used and displayed in an appropriate way. So what is the point? We do know that styling is important. It does help us understand the content. It's more than just making things look good, although making things look good is important too, but it does convey meaning. So back in the day, when primarily what we were doing was publishing to print, we used the tools we had. They seemed to work just fine. So font size and font weight are a good indication of the relative importance of items of text. Bullet points would be used to introduce brief ideas. All fine. If we have notes or hazard, we might use a red font to indicate danger, or an amber to indicate warning, things like that. Even the layout on the page, the position on the page can be important. So if you're will emphasize a certain aspect of what you're trying to say and actually make it more interesting. And I'm hoping I'm going to stay connected because I just got a message saying my connection is unstable. Cross our fingers. So that did seem to work fine. Things like if you're on a web page, this particular slide goes absolutely against what we would be going for on a web page, because at least in our culture, we tend to read left to right, top to bottom. So it would be an F-shaped design that would put the most important information where it gets the most focus. Of course, that will not work if you are going to a language that reads right to left. So the benefits of semantic markup, there are many. So I did not list them all. I picked 4 out. There are others, and these are all interrelated. So as we go through, we'll look at some of these, but we'll also use the same examples to talk about some of the others and some of the things that aren't necessarily on this slide. And now I'm going to just get away from the styling done by PowerPoint and get into some examples. So headings are important for search engine optimization. They help the search engine understand what things are most important. So it can look in the headings for keywords and so on. So that's very important for that. And in this example, and this is what we see quite often, in this example, we have things which to us look like 2 headings. But this was authored in Word, and we can see that Word does not recognize this one as a heading. Why is that? If it does not see that as a heading, it's not going to get treated as such by the search engine. It's not going to help us find the content that we're looking for. Well, it's because it's not actually a heading at all. It's actually normal font, and it's been manually updated to look like a heading. So to the human being, it's a heading. To the machine, it's not a heading. So we have to find a way to communicate to the machine that this is in fact meant to be a heading. Please treat it as such. The next thing is translation and localization. So what we've been doing up to now has worked just fine if we're in one language, one culture, and if everybody reading our content does not have a disability. So there are some issues for the fact that, let's face it, this is not necessarily our audience anymore. More and more, we are getting to audiences whose first language is not English. And as the population ages, there's more and more disability amongst our audience. So we do need more and more to address these things. So if we are translating, there's a number of things that we should consider. For example, we shouldn't just translate everything all willy-nilly. So for example, in computer code, a lot of that should not be translated. But you can't just necessarily say nothing in Courier font should be translated. You have to be more specific. Pick out the things that are the same no matter what language everything else is. So there's other examples of bits of text that should not be translated. So you can pick those out and make sure you keep those separate. Even if you are not translating, if you are selling in different countries with the same language even, localization could be an issue. So, for example, in some countries or in some applications, you may need to differentiate a first name from a last name because they are not always displayed in the order that they are typically here. So, and you can't always tell because If you have an Asian person, when they're at home, they would put their last name first and their first name last. But when they come to North America, they will often switch them to make life easier for us. So sometimes it's important to actually pick those things out so that they can be rendered in the right way. Same for things like currency. So for us, if we want to say something is $24.50, we put a dollar sign and then 24 and then period 00. In France, though, it would be 24 comma 00 and then the dollar sign. So the bits of that might need to be picked out for that as well. You look at those two dates that I have on this slide. So in the United States, it's accepted, well understood universally, that 9/11 refers to the 11th day of the 9th month. That's not the case everywhere. That's not how dates are necessarily rendered. So these two dates on the screen are both my birth date. I'm 63, just to save you the math. So I was born in the UK. So this first date is how my birth date would have been rendered there. So it's the 8th day of the 5th month of 1959. In the US, it would be the other way around. So the month would be first, then the day, then the year. Now, I'm in Canada. And Canada, of course, we take a lot of things from the UK and a lot of things from the US. And sometimes we do them both, which is very annoying. So I have come across examples of interfaces that have used both of these formats for the same date on the very same page. So it can be very confusing. So it is for sure worthwhile to pick out the parts of these so that they can be displayed in a way that's consistent for the market that you're aiming for. So accessibility. So essentially, for people who require assistive devices, those devices need to know about the purpose of a piece of content. So often when we think about accessibility, our mind turns to alt text for an image. And yes, that's important. It's rarely sufficient. Oftentimes, what I've seen is that some software will look at the image and generate some alt text. And it'll tell you, oh, this is a picture of a man, this is a picture of a dog, this is a picture of a tree. It may not be that useful, in fact. So that is something that probably needs to be added, as well as in some cases a long description. But there's other things about accessibility that can be done just based on what we find in the content. We can't depend on color or font or icons to convey meaning because a screen reader won't interpret those. Somebody with color blindness won't interpret those. Sometimes even the icons don't work well across different languages or destinations. And really, if you look at this table that we have here, this really quite complex table, how difficult is that to read for someone who is using a screen reader? Very difficult to build a mental picture of that as a screen reader reads it to you. So obviously it is ideal not to use this kind of table if you are trying to make your content accessible. There are things that can be done to help, though, and there is a very good description of all the different things that can be done as part of the DITA 1.3 specification. So there are things that could be done to help with that. So reusability. So there are, of course, content structures that can be reused in the content as it's published in multiple formats. So the most common things that we would reuse are things like copyright statements or notes or hazard statements, but there's many, many other things that can be reused as well. You can reuse chunks of topics, or you can reuse glossaries, or these sorts of things can all be easily reused. And one of my favorite things is that you can reuse these things not only in other publications, you can reuse them in your actual software. So in my software interface, which I will show you shortly, when it was originally built, of course, it was built by developers because that's their job. And if I tried to use the annotation for conkey ref, and I made a mistake in typing the argument to it, this is the error message I got. I challenge anybody to look at that and say, oh, I know what I did wrong. So what we did was, or what the developers did, was go into the documentation that had been written. And in the documentation, we had a syntax change one of these arguments or add another one. We would also change the documentation, and as it was all built, I would get the revised syntax diagram. So now it looks like this. This is much more useful. So if I just type in the conkey ref annotation incorrectly, this is what it tells me. This is much easier to understand. So from here, I'm just going to quickly show you the document that I put together to illustrate all of these things. And this is where we're going to start to see how we actually get this markup out. Okay, so this is a Word document that I put together. It's not a useful piece of documentation at all. It is just to show examples of how we go about getting some semantic markup out of the content that we have. So we can see that we have headings. We can see that we don't have an about topics heading here. So here it is. Now, of course, I could just go in and make that into a heading, but for demo purposes, I'm going to leave it the way it is. There's my date, which I have now put in yet a third format. In our lists, we have lists that are nested, and we have book titles in here. We're going to look at those briefly. We have a table here with definitions. And there's that stupid complex table. And if we go further down, what I've done here is just put in what we would want to make into a hazard statement. And the only way to know it is because of the red text, we know what kind it is. And at the very end, I've put this graphic, which has a bunch of call outs related to red boxes around it. And then it has a table explaining the meaning of each of those. As you can see, neither one of these things would be very useful all by themselves. So if we want to make it reusable, we have to make them into one reusable chunk. So let's now go to migrate, which is our tool that we will use to get our semantic markup out of that Word document. So this is the document that I have. And if I hit the Edit Rules button, it's going to show me my document with the rules applied that I've already put in place to convert this document the way I want it to. So here we see a rendition of the document, what it more or less looks like. So it's got most of the formatting available right here for me to see. It has more information that's going to show up on this side as well. And by using these, I can get the output that I want. So if I click on About Paragraphs here, that's a heading 2. And this tells me which rules have applied to heading 2 to make it the title of a concept. So I click on that, and this is matched 10 times. So where are all my headings? So it has also matched About Topics, even though that is not a heading 2. And that is because in this rule, I have just said, okay, it can be a heading 2, or it can be normal, that's blue and 13 points. So now, even though it's different going in, it's going to be treated the same on its way out as all the other headings. Lists, just to show the sorts of information that we get. So in this case, I can see, okay, the style is just list paragraph, but I can see that it's telling me also what type of list it is. So I see it's a disk, so I know it's an unordered list. And the list level shows me where it shows up in relation to other lists. So if this is list level 0, this is list level 1. So I know that this is inside this list. So if I go to my bulleted list rule, I can see that if my list level is 0, I've made it a bulleted list. I've just called it level 1. But if it is a higher nesting level, I've made it level 2, but I've also made it a step choice instead of bulleted list, because when Migrate finds this, if it finds it inside a list, it's just going to make it into a bulleted list item. But if it finds it inside a step, it's going to make it a choice. One thing I have found working with a lot of Word documents, there are an awful lot of paragraph styles that can be used for lists. So I've actually found that in some cases, it's better just not to include the style test at all, and just go simply on the list style and list level, and we're going to get the same results. So if we get those pieces of markup correct, it's going to help with our search engine optimization. It's going to help also with any sort of style sheet. Things are going to show up the way we expect them to show up. And of course, it is going to be better for people with disabilities, screen readers and other assistive devices, to know what are headings, what are lists, what are steps, that sort of thing. So this is going to do several things in one fell swoop. So now the next thing on our list was translation and localization. So here in our list, we've got this list item that says get a field guide, and then underneath that, we have the names of a couple of recommended books. Now, if we are recommending some books by title, we should not just simply translate the title. Now, how do I know it's a book title? Well, I, looking at it, know that convention tells me that if you're writing the title of a publication, it's going to be italicized and it's going to be title case. So now I just have to tell the computer that if it's italicized and title case, I want it to be a citation. So this is how I do it. And again, in this case, I've included the style, but I really didn't need to. The font style is italic, and I've just had it match more than one capitalized word without any punctuation or before we get to the end of the span. And so that works, and that makes a citation. So we have this type of information to go on as well. And now, because we are concerned about localization, let's go look at our hazard statement. So for us, red tells us it's danger. That is not the case everywhere in the world. Red can be a color of celebration, many a place. So we want to make sure that we are able to determine that this means danger for everybody, no matter what language we translate to or what country we publish in. So again, I know that it's danger because it's red. So I can tell the computer if it's red, it's going to be danger. So here's my rule for that. So I've just said, look, if the foreground is red, make it a hazard statement of type danger. I can do that because there's no other red text in this document, but if there were, I could look for the style in here, which is intense emphasis. I could look for the fact that it's centered. I could look for the font size. I have all of those things that I can use. But in this case, this was enough. And this guy is going to be the how to avoid. So then we will get a hazard statement out. We won't say anything at all about what color it should be in the actual markup, only that it's danger. And of course, that is, again, now more accessible for people who are, say, colorblind. So now we come to this graphic with a box with all its callouts explained. Now, in the rules editor, we don't show the image, but we've seen it. We know what sort of a mess it looks. Really, it's not at all accessible. So there are things that could be done to make it more accessible. But for right now, what we want to do is just make sure that this table gets inside the figure element with the image so that the whole thing can be reused at once. So I'm going to look at this table, and what I've done, let's see, I've left in the style. I probably didn't need to. I've looked to see if the first column has paragraphs in it that contain only digits. And I've also looked to make sure that there's no column spanning or row spanning. So now I can make it a simple table, and I can tell it to be inside the figure element. The other thing that I think we missed is this table up here. For the sake of both accessibility and for potential reuse, we have this definition list table. So it's pretty easy to pick out. It's 2 columns with a term and a definition. We can just strip out that table markup and make it into a definition list. This is easier for a screen reader. It is more reusable because it is easier to reuse a definition list entry, add it to another definition list, or make a smaller definition list. We could do it even more readily reused because we could make this into a glossary. So each row would become a gloss entry topic. So that's always another option. There are many, many options, of course, with DITA. And of course, the last thing I did want to show was that lovely syntax diagram. So here I've got a version number in my text, And if I want to publish this same topic when we put out version 4.2, let's say, I just want to replace that with the current version number. So I've pulled it out, and in this case, I've made it a conkey ref just because that was the example that we used. So here's my rule. And because I've had a look at that syntax diagram, I know that this is the appropriate annotation. But supposing I mistyped it. And I hit done. And now I get this message. So now I get this lovely syntax diagram and parameter list, which will be updated when the docs are updated if they need to be. So I'm going to say, no, I don't want to submit. I'm going to undo what I did. There we go. That's all good. So then I would just be able to go in and hit convert here. And then I would get out some data. So this is what the data map will look like. So we can see that the year has come out as book change history. It's approved and completed, 1959, 5th month, 8th day. Now let's look at the rest of the things. You see I've got my conkey refs listed there. So let's go to about lists. And in here, we can see we've got our citations. We've got our nested lists as we would expect. Let's go to our tables. So you can see now we have a definition list here instead of the table. This is that really complex table, and it still is a really complex table. And I did only put one piece of markup in there, but we can see that. So I've just given it the subhead and scope, or sorry, the headers and scope attributes to be picked out. There is a lot more complex markup available. And we can see that about topics is there. And here's our hazard statement. Again, it just says danger. This is generated on publication, the danger label. And in this case, it's put a kind of a red background, but your style sheet could put any kind of a background you want. And then we've got our hazard statement, our type of hazard, and then we've got our how to avoid. And here is our figure. So which we will just quickly look at the text so we can see that the figure element encompasses all of that. So now we can reuse this whole figure. Ideally, we would give the figure a title as well. This is a good example of a not very useful alt text. And here we have our conkey ref, which has been resolved, so we can see what it would look like, but we know that it's a conkey ref. So if I were to change the value of the conkey ref, so this by itself is going to make this content more reusable. You can see it's already showing up as 4.1 because I've done that. So just the fact that I can do that change quickly with just a conkey ref, this whole topic now becomes a lot more reusable. So just to sum up, semantic markup really allows the machine to understand the same clues that a human reader needs to understand the content. We just need to find a way to tell the machine about them so that it can then be programmed to display them in whatever way is appropriate for the consumer. So ultimately, this will improve the quality of the content for the human reader here and now, elsewhere and in the future. So you can do this and configure your style sheet to make things look exactly the way they do now, but still you have all this information available so that you can do different things in the future if you need to. If you want to expand and translate, you can do that quite easily. If you acquire or merge with another company, all of this can be consolidated. So, any questions or comments? That's my contact info there if you want to get in touch with me at another time.
Helen, thank you very much. That was very informative. I know I learned a lot.
It's always fun to do it.
Absolutely. So at this time, remember you can put, excuse me, your questions in the chat box. I don't have any at this time, but please, oh, what? We do have one. Have you used MD and what was your experience on it compared to Dita?
So sorry, can you repeat the question for me? Have I used what?
MD.
MD.
Markdown.
Oh, Markdown. Okay. We haven't used Markdown because, well, there's various flavors of Markdown, for one thing. Markdown is a very interesting thing and can be used really along with Dita. So though we've had people come to us in the past and say, can you convert Markdown to Dita? Ultimately, people don't, because you can publish your Markdown along with your Dita, with the Dita Open Toolkit. So we haven't done any work directly with Markdown for those reasons.
Interesting. So, and again, I'm not as familiar. So they can be used interchangeably, or you keep one in one and one in the other.
So you can, when you publish, you can use your maps can refer to Markdown topics just as they can with Dita. If you use the correct setup, the Dita Open Toolkit plugins can be done.
Interesting. Okay, any other questions? Feel free to put them in the Q&A. Okay, I'm going to give it another minute and then we'll wrap up a little early if there aren't any Q&As.
Sure. People can always write to me. My
Yes.
email address is there if they think of questions afterwards.
Absolutely. So again, make sure you have that contact. And as a reminder, we will be sending out the recording to all of those who registered and also posted on our website on CIDM with all our past webinars. So I think that is all we have right now. So I want to thank you, Helen. It was a very informative webinar.
And thanks for the opportunity, Trish.
Absolutely. And thank you for all of you joining us for our CIDM webinars. All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.